So it's most appropriate, I think, and I can't think of a better person to give today's lecture, so please welcome Bernice Barry.
Thanks, Don. It's always a pleasure to come to any events in Augusta, because it's always such a warm welcome, but it's a real privilege to be here to do this talk today. So thank you to Urga. I also want to just acknowledge the traditional guardians of the land that we're on, the Pibbleman and Wadandi people, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present. The talk today is a little bit different from the previous talks. We, in the past, have heard lectures largely about the setting, the environment, the world in which the human dramas of the early settlement were enacted, the botany, the environmental issues, the plants, the flowers, the ecology. And Don asked me on this occasion to talk about something slightly different. He asked me to talk about the history. He also asked me if I would share with you some of the new things to do with the research that have come up more recently than when the book was published. Some of the things I found out that I didn't know when I was writing the book and when that book was published. I didn't think it would be a good idea to stand here in talking about the history and tell you who the settlers were, because I'm talking about the people, where they came from, what land grants they had, what they brought with them in the hold of the Emily Taylor, how they starved in the first year because the government supplies didn't turn up. I really very much have the feeling that you know that part of the story. The setting is very familiar to us. I thought that I would talk about the other aspect of the settlement, the settlers themselves and what it was that they brought with them that wasn't so immediately obvious, that wasn't necessarily with them in the trunks and barrels and boxes that they had in the hold of the Emily Taylor. We know what they brought with them, we know what they had, the very simple life they lived. We know what they had to do without in the first couple of years and the great privations that they had. I actually think that some of the most important things that that little band of about 50 people brought with them weren't in the boxes on the raft that Tom Turner painted in that first year. I think the important baggage they brought with them was in here and in here, because those values and attitudes and beliefs that they had influenced everything they did. The way that they used the things that they had with them, the language they used when they talked to one another. Whoops, it's flying really likes me. I think it's going to hang around. Influenced the way that they interacted with the other settlers and the way that they didn't. It interacted who they became close to and who they became friendly with and who they fell out with and who they blocked. I'm going to talk about two sort of aspects really there, and try also to share with you where some of that information came from in terms of the sources. And I want to really try and stick today with sources that are the kinds of things that are accessible to everybody. Some of them, most of them are free. Some of them are things that you might have to pay an access fee for. But I'm not going to go through things that are only in family archives. I'm going to talk about really two aspects of this personal baggage that they brought with them, and try to show you how it influenced the stories that we already know about who worked well with who, how the settlement worked together, why they fell out, why there were small rifts between some of the families. The first one is what I think of as their sort of collective memory, their collective social memory. I'm thinking about the kinds of things that were very much part of what everybody believed and the values that they all had, whether they were the wife of one of the military, whether it was James Woodward Turner's wife or one of his children, whether it was John Molloy, whoever it was, the sorts of beliefs that these people had that were the result of a lifetime of social conditioning. And the other thing I want to talk about is the much more personal baggage, that's a modern word that we use, but it's what I'm talking about, the much more personal baggage that the families and the individuals brought with them, which really impacted on the familiar stories of the first few years of the settlement. And I'll talk a little bit about James Woodward Turner, a little bit about Elijah Dawson and his family, but I'll focus a little bit more on the Bustles, because I've got one or two interesting pieces of information that show really why they were the people that they were when they arrived, why they wrote in the way that they did, because we know the Bustles were great writers. So the first thing is the general set of values and attitudes that these people brought with them. We can think of that period of time as a time of science, the age of science, and it's often described as that. But it's also, I think, important to remember that this was the time of the great wave of the Romantic Revolution, with a capital R, the Romantic era. Very much a result that happened after the Industrial Revolution, after enclosure in Britain. Things had been changing for a long time. The countryside was beginning to disappear as people remembered it. And there was a harking back to the good old days when you could go out into the countryside and wander in a wilderness. As more people moved into the cities after the Industrial Revolution, the cities encroached out into the countryside. Enclosure had changed the look of the British countryside. Fields, little square fields, hedges, fences, boundaries everywhere. You couldn't walk wherever you wanted to walk anymore. And there was very much a sense of wanting to get back to nature, wanting to get back to what people, we always think of the past, don't we? It's wonderful. Wanting to get back to man in nature, or of course woman in nature as well. You might recognise this very familiar painting. It's often used as a sort of perfect example of the Romantic era, the period in time when the settlers were arriving in Augusta. It was actually in my mind a lot when I was writing the Georgiana Molloy book, because it shows what people thought of themselves, mankind, in the face of the wilderness. This man is in awe of the unknown landscape in front of him. He's probably fearful, but he is going to conquer it. You can tell by the stance. He is going to go out there and make his way through this wilderness, and he is going to conquer it. But he's a little afraid of it. This was a period when people, poets and writers in particular, but painters and musicians as well, were beginning to find new ways to talk and think about the wilderness, the landscape, the unknown land. They were even inventing new words. Words like sublime, beautiful, and picturesque were given very strict new definitions and meaning. For example, sublime, if you call something sublime around 1800, what you meant very specifically was the feeling of seeing something or being in a place that was so beautiful that you were left in awe, breathless, but also so frightening that you were in danger or you were feeling fearful. And that feeling on the edge that we've all experienced in certainly if you've been mountain climbing or those kinds of places, that was the feeling of sublime. Now, we know that all these families, I mean the military had to be here because they were posted here. The surgeon had to be here because he was posted here. But the families who came as settlers and the people who came with them, we know that they were here because they were looking for a new life where they could achieve the things that they couldn't achieve at home. Most of them hadn't succeeded in the way that they felt they should have succeeded. They couldn't have what they wanted, what they thought their families needed back in Britain. But I think there was also something else, and I think it was this. And I think when they arrived in Perth and they were confronted with the ramshackle tents on the beach, with people living in their tents surrounded by their livestock, their animals, their dogs, the fleas and the dysentery, and when Lieutenant Governor Stirling told them about the chance to come down to the far southwest and described it to them, because he'd been here not that long previously, I think this was something that was in their minds as well. And if you've read any of the writing of the settlers, in particular the writing of the Beloys, the Bustles, and many, even the servants, even the letters that young Edward Pierce wrote home, you get a very, very strong sense of their writing about themselves in the wilderness. It's a very strong thread. One of the most important aspects of that when they arrived here was their gardens. It was their block of land, the boundary around their garden and the garden that they had. If they had a block of land with a fence around it and a garden, that said in a very tangible way that they were successful. For a British person to have land, to own land, even if it was a land grant that wasn't officially still theirs for a few years, meant that they had arrived. If they had flowers in their garden that they were cutting for the table, that said something else as well. That says we don't just have to grow food in our garden, we've actually got leisure time. We can actually afford to grow plants as well. We don't have to grow just vegetables.